Thank you for all the introductions, and thank you all for being here tonight. I think this full house speaks to the fact that this is a very important issue. I gave a talk last year. I gave a talk in front of an 8th grade class, and in preparation for my talk, these 8th graders, who are 13 years old, prepared themselves. They studied the issue, and they took a poll to find out who among them had hope. Who among them believed that peace was possible in their lifetime? And the results of their poll were pretty depressing. They found that 80% of them, and they're 13 years old, did not believe peace was possible in their lifetime. So, and they told me this before I began my remarks. And so I told them that I'm a lot older than they are. I'm 51, and there's no question in my mind that there will be peace in my lifetime. But I think the importance of the hope is not that we know that it's going to happen tomorrow. The importance of the hope is believing and understanding, not just believing, but understanding that it's possible, and then doing everything we can in order to make it happen. If we're hopeless and we sit home and we just let things, go as they are, without hope, I mean, what's the drive to move forward and actually do something? And this issue is complicated. There's no question about that, and it's only complicated because it's covered in so many layers of myth and so much double standard. And it's interesting because it's particularly in North America, people believe they're really doing the right thing, even though they are clearly supporting the wrong side. Whether it's in the US, here in Canada, in Britain, in Germany, in other countries in the West, people firmly believe they're helping Jewish people by supporting Israel, where in fact all evidence points to the opposite. And one of the biggest myths, well, this is one of the biggest myths, but one of the biggest double standards has to do with what it is that the so-called Jewish state is all about. Because Israel was created as a so-called Jewish state by a movement called Zionism. And the early Zionists, my grandparents were part of them, their point of view was that Jewish people, being that they are the descendants of an ancient tribe that lived in that part of the world some 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, have the right, and listen to this, have the right to return to their homeland. So it wasn't me, my parents, my grandparents, or my great-great-parents that lived there and now we are returning. We're talking about a connection or a claim to have a connection or relation to an ancient tribe that resided in that part of the world some several thousand years ago, which gives all Jewish people in the world the right, and they use the word to return. And you have to wonder, how are they able to sell this? How are they able to sell such an absurd notion that because the Jewish people may be the descendants, it's not clear that they are, but maybe the descendants of this ancient tribe, they have the right to conquer an Arab country, engage in ethnic cleansing, and then build a state for themselves on that land. Now that's bad enough, but now let's take a look, let's put this right next to another discussion about the right of return. The right of return of Palestinians. And I'm sure you've seen this, and I'm sure you've heard this, when Israelis and Palestinians, when the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian peace or Israeli-Palestinian negotiations are brought up, the right of return is one issue where Israelis and people who support Israel say, absolutely not. The right of return, there's a red line, we cannot cross it, there's no room to talk about the right of return. It was a long time ago. The Palestinians have to, are you ready for this? They have to forget, because this was a long time ago. So even though many of the Palestinians who were forced out of their home 65 years ago are still alive, some of them in this room today, And even though those that passed away certainly have descendants that are still alive, they still have the deeds to their homes, the keys to their homes, and if they don't, they can show you, they can walk with you to a field full of rubble, and they will find their home, and they will find the mosque, and they will find the well. But those people have to forget, because this was a long time ago. And this is coming from a nation, Israelis, Jewish people, right, who sit every Passover and talk about what? Commemorate something the pharaohs did to, so-called did to the Jews some 5,000, 6,000 years ago. So this is we are commanded to remember, but the Palestinians 65 years ago have to forget. I mean, this is a double standard of such unbelievable proportions. You wonder how anybody is able to sell this. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because the Zionists in today's Israel have always had a very powerful and very smart and effective lobby that was used to sell this stuff. But I think it's important to put this, to really take a good look at this and understand this amazing double standard that exists here. And to sift through the myth and to understand that supporting Israel and supporting Jews have absolutely nothing to do with each other. The Zionists proclaimed themselves to represent the Jews. Nobody voted for them. Nobody voted for my grandfather and his group of that whole generation. They decided that they were going to do this. They were well-dressed. They were well-educated. They were white. And so they were able to convince the British and then the Americans and so forth that they had a right to settle that land, which was settled by brown people, basically. And so we as white people have a right to kick them out, because this is how we do things. This makes perfect sense. And that is exactly why they succeeded. And and they had nothing to do with Judaism. Most Jews have never supported Israel. Most Jews have never gone to Israel. Even after the Holocaust, most Jews, most survivors opted to go to other places. So this notion that somehow Israel represents Jews and opposing Israel is opposing Jews or anti-Semitic is completely not true. And I think this is very, very important to understand. Now, I should have said this earlier, but my point of view is certainly not a balanced point of view. And I think it's important. Usually I say this a little bit earlier. I somehow forgot. I think if anybody came here expecting to hear a balanced presentation, then they're going to be sorely disappointed. But I think it's important to understand that this is not a balanced situation. There is no balanced presentation on this issue, because there is no balance in this issue. It's not like two people or two children who are, or just can't get along. It's like a lunatic with a loaded gun shooting innocent civilians all over the place, and somebody's got to step in and do something. Now, we heard about the Nakba in the introduction this evening, and I have to tell you, I was born and raised as a very proud and very patriotic Israeli. And when I heard for the first time that Palestinians were calling the War of Independence, our independence, a catastrophe, I was insulted. I was personally insulted. How could anybody call such an important historical event a catastrophe? The rebirth of the Jewish people, finally, Israelis, the Jewish people have their own state and have their independence and so on, and somebody sees it as a catastrophe? And over the years, as I met Palestinians and heard more stories and became more knowledgeable on this issue, I understood why it's called a catastrophe and why it was a catastrophe, and understood that it was a catastrophe. But it wasn't until just a few weeks ago that I saw the catastrophe. I visited two places that I'd not visited before. One was a refugee camp in Jordan called the Gaza refugee camp. And this is a refugee camp of refugees. So in other words, they were refugees in Gaza in 48, and then in 67 they moved and became refugees in Jordan. And the living conditions, the despair, the poverty, the fact that these beautiful children have to live with no running water, no sewage, in houses that you can't even call houses, 10, 12, 15 people in a room. That this can happen to their house or their friend's house any day. After I visited that refugee camp, the Gaza refugee camp, a couple of days later, I actually visited Gaza as well. This is from Gaza itself. The children need to walk to school every day seeing this and not knowing if they come home after school, this will be their home. That nearly 2 million people have to live under siege, where their entire life depends on this, tunnels. This is the particular tunnel that I went through to go into Gaza. Because, of course, going through Israel is prohibited, and going through Egypt sometimes is prohibited, sometimes is not. So I ended up going through the tunnel. The boundary of less than 10 kilometers, you have 1,500 tunnels like this. And this is what keeps people in Gaza alive. Nearly 2 million people. These are the places where you see the Nakba. It's inexcusable, it's unjustifiable, it's inexplicable. In the refugee camp itself, in the Gaza refugee camp in Jordan, like I said, the poverty is so extreme that it's hard to put in words. And at the same time, the houses are meticulously clean. There's no running water, there's no sewage system. 40,000 people living on 1 square kilometer. And you know that about 53% are children. And this is an hour drive from Tel Aviv. All of this. It's an hour drive from Jerusalem. I could have gone from Jerusalem to Gaza in an hour and 15 minutes. It took me 14 hours because I had to go to Sinai and through Egypt and go under a tunnel. It's absolutely absurd. And this is why it's a Nakba. And it's an ongoing thing. It's not something that happened 65 years ago. There's this illusion that the Nakba is something that happened 65 years ago. It began 65 years ago. It goes on to this day. So I went from this place where it offended me that somebody called the Israeli independence Nakba to seeing it, understanding it, and then finally seeing it. And the second part of the title of my book is The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. My journey is still ongoing. It's not done yet. I'm discovering more and more and more about Palestine and more about what it means, what Palestine means and what being Palestinian means every single day. I think that a good place in history to start talking about this conflict and starting to understand this conflict is the 29th of November, 1947. That was the day the United Nations came up with this absurd map. This is called the Partition Resolution. The United Nations decided that to end the conflict or to solve the conflict, the Jewish-Arab conflict in Palestine, they would partition the land into 2 parts and create a Jewish state and an Arab state. And this absurd, ridiculous map is what they came up with. And when you look at this thing, you don't have to be a genius to realize that this is absolutely crazy. I mean, how do you go on the ground and delineate the borders? I mean, look at this thing. But beyond that, the United Nations, in their infinite wisdom, decided to give the larger portion of the country that belonged to somebody else, not to them, to a small group of Jewish immigrants. At that time, there were less than 500,000 Jewish immigrants living in Palestine. There were about 1.5 million Palestinians who were the Palestinians, to whom this land belonged. Yet the United Nations partitioned the land and decided they were going to give the larger portion to the smaller community of Jewish immigrants. And to this day, we hear people say, you see, this is all the Palestinians' fault because they did not accept the partition resolution. Did somebody in their right mind expect that the Palestinians would accept this? Why would they? Who in their right mind would expect this such an absurd resolution? That somebody from the outside, the United Nations, would come, cut off the larger portion of your country, and give it to somebody else. And I don't think anybody expected they would accept it, and I don't think anybody accepted this would work. And as we know, this did not last a single day. And what happened the next day is exactly where the 2 narratives begin to go in opposite directions. As an Israeli, what did I learn? Is what do people still learn in the United States and in Europe? That the Palestinians, or what they say the Arabs, because in Zionist language there is no such thing as Palestinian. The Arabs did not accept the partition resolution and began a massive attack to destroy and kill this small Jewish community. But miraculously, even though the Jewish community was smaller and weaker, somehow they prevailed, because we, this Zionist community, we the Jews, we are the descendants of King David who fought Goliath, and we are the descendants of the Maccabees, and we have that ability to overcome this sort of thing, and we defeated the bad Arab armies, those big bad Arab armies, and within 12 months the state of Israel was established, and so on and so forth. And it's a wonderful story, especially when you're a kid. Especially when you know that your father was an officer in those Zionist forces, in those Jewish forces that fought so bravely. But then we take a look at the details and we say, is it really possible that a small Jewish community attacked by massive Arab armies would not only prevail, but manage to conquer 80% of the country, displace 1 million people, and destroy hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of towns and cities and villages within 12 months? Is it possible? This is not some biblical story. This is something that happened. We can't go back and say, well, the prophets and God and all this. And then we take a look at the details and we realize that these two communities, the Zionist community that was living at the time and the Palestinian communities, they were both expecting and hoping to become states. So they had institutions of state and so on. But there was one thing that the Zionist community had that invested in heavily, and the Palestinians did not. A fighting force. The Zionist militia, by that time, numbered close to 40,000 well-armed men, and very well trained and very well indoctrinated. My father was an officer in that militia. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. So in 1947, at the end of 1947, beginning of 1948, who are these Arabs that attacked? What did they attack with? They had no militia, they had no weapons. It's true that the Arab armies, other Arab armies intervened, but that wasn't until 6-7 months later. Well, there were no Arabs that attacked. As soon as this resolution was accepted, the Zionist militia began a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in an effort to conquer as much of the land as possible and get rid of as many people as possible. That was the name of the game, and that is what they managed to accomplish. And when the other Arab armies did intervene, they were no match for the Zionist forces. Not in numbers, not in training, not in the quality of the weapons, not in anything. Certainly not in motivation. And within 12 months, 80% of the country was conquered, 1 million people, or close to 1 million people, were displaced, and hundreds of towns and villages were wiped off the face of the earth. Some of these towns, by the way, and villages had a long history of over 1,000 years. And on their ruins, the state of Israel was created. Towns and villages and cities and highways were built for Israelis only. Now, what's interesting, what I did in the book, I kind of go back and forth between the story of my family and the story of the conflict, the story of the land. And this is a picture of my mother when she was young. She's 86 years old now. She was born and raised in Jerusalem. She still lives there. Like I said, she's 86 years old. And in 1948, she was 22. She was already a young mother. And she was living in a small apartment with her mother in Jerusalem. Now, because she was born and raised in Jerusalem, she knew Jerusalem very well, and she knew the neighborhoods, including the Palestinian neighborhoods, and the Palestinian families, and so on. In 1948, when the Zionist forces took these neighborhoods, and I'm not talking about the old city of Jerusalem. There were neighborhoods outside the old city of Jerusalem, flourishing neighborhoods, with beautiful homes, beautiful, well-to-do families that lived there. Those neighborhoods are still there, the homes are still there, just the people are not. And they were forced to leave, and their homes were made available to Israeli families. And of course, my mother was the wife of an officer who was in the front fighting for the cause. She was offered one of these homes in one of these neighborhoods. And when she told me this story years and years ago, and she told it to me many, many times, and I talk about it in the book, and I speak to her about it a lot. And whenever she talks about it, it raises the same emotions. She says, how could I possibly take the home of another family? How can I possibly move into the home of another mother? And then she continued and said, and to see the trucks full of loot. The Israeli forces filled up trucks with loot because these are well-to-do families. These are beautiful homes. Like I said, they're still there. And if you've been to Jerusalem, you've seen them. They're very distinct. And what's interesting about the story, not only that she made the type of moral decision that you would hope other people would have made at 22, but more than that, there was something about the story that bothered me for years and years and years. And it wasn't until actually quite recently when I was working on the book that I could understand why it was bothering me and what the problem was. To begin with, her story was contradicting the national narrative. Because if the national narrative is that they attacked, we won, and they left, that's what Israelis learn. Well, then why can't we take their homes? It's perfectly legitimate. She was presenting a moral question. And on top of that, she was presenting something that we, the Israelis, did wrong without explaining or excusing it. See, in the Israeli discourse, in Zionist discourse, every time the Israelis do something horrific to the Palestinians, whether it's Dir Yassin, whether it's attacking Gaza, regardless, there's always a justification. The way Israelis learn about Dir Yassin is, yes, it was a horrible thing, but thank goodness, because that caused hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to flee, which enabled us to become the majority. So with the admittance that this was a massacre and was a horrible thing, comes the excuse, but thank goodness because. This is how this is always told. Even today, Israel bombs Gaza knowing that they're killing civilians, but there's always a justification. My mother was telling the story and there was no justification. It was the first time I ever heard anybody talk about this, where the Palestinians were on equal footing as any other human being. This was wrong, period. This is unacceptable, immoral, period. And that was a very interesting experience. And again, like I said, I only came to terms with how meaningful it was quite recently. By the end of 1948, this is what the map looked like. Palestine, most of Palestine became Israel, except for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The West Bank was part of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was part of Egypt. And then in 1967, in the spring and early summer of 1967, the drums of war began beating when the Egyptian president decided or talked about attacking Israel. He brought his forces into the Sinai Peninsula, which was supposed to be demilitarized. He threatened to close the Straits of Tiran. These are the straits leading up to the port city of Eilat. And the Israeli generals decided this was an opportunity for war. This was a cause for war. When the State of Israel was created, many of the young officers who were serving at the time remained. My father was one of them, and by 1967, these were the generals. So these generals of 1967 were the young commanders of 1948, and they were eager for war, and they were eager to take the West Bank. They felt it was a big mistake that the West Bank wasn't taken in 1948, where it could have been taken. So for them, this was a burning issue, and they saw an opportunity. Now, once again, the story we hear about the 1967 war is that, again, the Israelis were attacked, viciously attacked, unprovoked, by 3 Arab armies who wanted to destroy the State of Israel. And once again, miraculously, this time not in 12 months, but in 6 days, we not only prevailed, we destroyed them, and we conquered lands and tripled the size of the State of Israel. This is a picture of my father. The name of the book, the title of the book is, or the first part of the title is The General's Son. Now, like I said, my father was a general at the time, and he always said that this was not true. From the very beginning, he said this was a war of choice. This was a war, this was a preemptive, the reason we took a preemptive strike is because we felt we could. Now, the talk at the time was about a war against Egypt, to attack Egypt, to punish the Egyptian president for entering his forces into the Sinai and so forth. There was some debate between the generals and the Israeli cabinet as to whether or not to begin the war. It went on for several days. It was a heated debate. One of the strongest, most forceful voices for the war was my father. And of course, the generals won the day like they always did in Israel. And the war against Egypt lasted several days. The Egyptian army was destroyed. The Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip were taken. Then the generals on their own decided to take the West Bank and the Golan Heights because these were two areas that they wanted, number one. And number two, the generals who were in charge of those regions wanted part of the glory. And within 6 days, the state of Israel, the land, the area of the state of Israel was tripled in size. Now, when people try to justify what Israel did, they say, well, Israel was under threat. Israel was under an existential threat. In other words, they had no choice but to attack. As I was working on the book, I went in to look at the Israeli Army archives to learn about my father's military career. And one of the things that I looked at were the minutes of the meetings of the generals leading up to that war. They're available. Many historians have looked at them. Many people have written about them. So I wasn't really expecting to see anything new. But there was one thing that I saw that was striking that I had not seen anywhere else. And that is where the generals say clearly, the fact that the Egyptians have brought their forces closer to us present an opportunity because the Egyptian army is not prepared for war. Not prepared for war. Not a single word about a threat, certainly not an existential threat, but an opportunity because the Egyptian army, which was really the only army of consequence, the Jordanian and Syrian army were in shambles anyway. They were no match for the IDF. We're not prepared for war, and therefore we have an opportunity to go in and attack. So they went into this war knowing full well that they were going to win. The story about the threat came later on to excuse it, to justify it. And then again, now you understand how in 6 days this happened. There were no Arab armies that attacked. The Arab armies that were there were in shambles, were no match for the Israeli army, which was well armed and well prepared and very motivated. And then within 6 days, the Sinai was taken, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. 3 Arab armies were destroyed. 15,000 Arab soldiers were killed in 6 days. 15,000 Arab soldiers were killed. 700 Israeli soldiers were killed. The ratio says it all. Now, every soldier that dies is somebody's son. It breaks your heart. But the ratio is stunning. This was a war of choice. This was a war of conquest. And indeed, at the end of that war, this is what happened. Palestine was completely erased off the map, and Israel took its place completely. Now, what Israel did in the West Bank after the 1967 war is exactly what Israel did in the rest of Palestine after 1948. Ethnic cleansing, destructions of towns and villages and cities, and massive building for Israelis only on Palestinian land. In other words, this was not something different. This was finishing the job. And this is exactly how Israeli commanders talk about it, and politicians. Taking the West Bank was finishing the job of 1948. It was finishing the conquest of the land of Israel for the Jews.